welcome. Good morning, good afternoon to whoever is joining us. Good evening if you're in Israel. Welcome to Aspire, JFN's annual high holiday event. I am thrilled to have you join us today. And to start us off, I'd love to introduce our CEO, Andres Spokoiny.
Hi, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. It's a big pleasure to be here with you today. Aspire is kind of a unique JFN event. It's deliberately not very tahlilic. We're not trying to teach you a technique of philanthropy with this event. We are not trying to analyze a funding field. What we're trying to do with these free high holiday gatherings is to really dig deeper and do a little bit of Torah Lishma. Let's start researching and studying and reflecting just for its own sake, for the sake of it, our own personal enrichment and enriching the Jewish conversation. So in past years, we talked about the future of community, the future of the synagogue, and this year, we wanted to dedicate our pre-holiday program to make a deep dive into the reality and the relevance of the denominations and movements that shaped much of modern Jewish history. 200 years ago, Jews emerged out of the shtetls and ghettos of Central and Eastern Europe, and they confronted modernity, and they were perplexed by what they found, and by how to adapt modernity and Judaism in a single harmonic existence. And they found responses that helped them navigate the complexities of being a Jew in the modern world. Those responses are the movements that are the scaffolding of Jewish communal life to this very day: Reform, Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, conservative, Reconstructionist, etc. But then 200 years later, we need to ask questions. When many Jews define themselves as post-denominational, when classic denominations are losing affiliation, are these denominations still relevant? Are they adapting? How they are adapting? Are they still, and can they still provide the meaning that we need? These conversations are, in a way, philosophical, but they're also very urgent, because one of the main issues of Jewish life and one of the main quests of Jews today, especially after the pandemic, is the quest for meaning. And those denominations, those movements, were the main providers of meaning and comfort and spirituality for the modern era. So can they still do the same? Are they still doing the same in the 21st century? It is amazing that we have the leaders and key figures on each of these movements to actually reflect on that openly and honestly about the promise that the movements still have and about the issues that they confront. So we're really very honored, and without further ado, you don't want to hear me, you want to hear them. I'll give back the floor to Rabbi Rebecca Sirbu to take us on.
Thank you, Andres. Thank you for setting the scene for us. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce our panelists. First, Dr. Shuly Rubin Schwartz, who is the Chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary and the Irving Lerman Research Professor of American Jewish History. Welcome, Shuly. Next, we have Rabbi Rick Jacobs, who is the President for the Union for Reform Judaism. Hi, Rick. Then we have Rabbi Joseph Dweck, who is the Senior Rabbi of the S&P Sephardi Community of the United Kingdom. Welcome. And Rabbi Chaim Steinmetz, who is the Senior Rabbi of Kehilath Jeshurun on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. So welcome to each one of you. We will put fuller biographies into the chat for those who are interested in learning more about your backgrounds. I didn't want to take up the time of going through all of your very illustrious backgrounds. As we are going to have a conversation today, I want to encourage participants to go ahead and post questions in the Q&A. We on the moderator side will be able to see them and can integrate them into the conversation that we're having. And I want to state that this is really meant to be a conversation. This is not going to be a traditional panel where I'm just shooting questions to one or the other. I want our panelists to interact with each other, respond to what each other has to say, so that we can all learn as much as possible. So I'm going to start us off with the following question, which is, do denominations still play a crucial role in Jewish life? And if so, what is that role that they play, or what role should they play? And let me call on Shuly. Why don't you begin?
Sure, thank you. Pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to discuss this with my colleagues. Look, we all know that there have always been many different kinds of Jews throughout Jewish history. From that homogenization has never been the natural state of the Jewish people. Jews never agree on anything, whether it is different minhagim, different interpretations of halacha, different emphases. Some of us love to study, others love to be out there in the world as Jews making a difference. Some of us are drawn to spirituality, others to social justice. Denominations were one way of answering the varying needs of the Jewish people as they confronted modernity. What is my way of relating to the modern world going to be? And each of our movements represented here today offer different ways of navigating that very challenging period in Jewish life. As far as I can see, they continue to offer nourishment to hundreds of thousands of Jews. Now, we know we live in a society now where being defined by any one label, whether it be the denominational label or any other kind of identifying label, feels limiting to us. So denominations no longer hold the same space in people's lives of like, this is who I am. I'm an Orthodox Jew. I am a conservative Jew. I am a Reform Jew, right? And yet it is one among many ways that individuals identify. No question, denominations are in evolving, in transition now, as we are now in the 21st century, 200 years from the advent of modernity. And yet, post-denominational or saying, oh, we're all one Jewish people, that's always been a fantasy, and it will continue to be. We will never be only one thing. And I'll just add, that would greatly impoverish the Jewish people to try to say, oh, we're all just Jews.
I would say this. I mean, I agree that the denominational, I mean, if we're talking about denominations as ideologies, not as, actual organizations, Shuly's correct that there is a less of an interest in the ideologies, except, and this is a big except, there's less of an interest in ideologies except when the person is very, very deeply engaged. The more deeply engaged you are in Jewish life, the more you're interested in ideology. And perhaps part of the reason why ideologies are less interesting is because many are not that engaged in their Jewish life, for which ideology doesn't really matter. Like, in other words, you theoretically could have the same person who would consider a Reform synagogue and a Chabad synagogue, because it's really more about the ambiance and it's about what connects them. And they're really not that concerned about the ideology of the person there. But if you go to the most deeply involved Jews, and I certainly rabbis or a lot of people that I know, ideology matters a great deal. Even within Orthodoxy, ideology matters a great deal. Having said that, I do want to add one other thing, and this is actually an inner Orthodox debate about how to relate to other denominations. And this is actually something that I think is very critical to think about. And actually this is, I think, Shuly's point. I think very often, Orthodox Jews feel, okay, we're authentic. I mean, that's part of the discourse. I don't want to get into debate about that right now, but there's this discourse of authenticity. And the feeling is that the other movements have no meaning whatsoever. And the debate I have with many of my own Orthodox colleagues is I very often say that had the conservative and reform movements not existed, we would have had to invent them. Because I think from an Orthodox perspective, you realize that not everybody is going to be drawn to Orthodoxy, and we need to find different portals. And on this, I absolutely agree with what Shuly was saying, is that the importance of having a lot of different ways to enter into Jewish identity is significant, and we all have to appreciate the job that's being done, because there are so many different Jews, and not all of them will be connected through the same portal.
I'll jump in. I don't disagree with what my colleagues have put forth so far. I will say, however, that as a Sephardic Jew, denominations don't really run in Sephardic Judaism, and it was interesting because Andres, in his introduction, he said Jews came out of shtetls, as a result of the Enlightenment, and I, as he said that, I thought in my head, well, some Jews, came out of shtetls. So the Sephardic story is a bit different, and we don't have denominational Judaism, perhaps because we did not face the Enlightenment in the same way as. And when I say we, I am making a sweeping statement, because even among Sephardic Jews, there are Western Sephardic Jews, like the community that I have the great honor of leading. There are Eastern Sephardic Jews that really didn't even touch the Enlightenment just because of the circumstances of their geography, and a whole bunch of stuff in between. I wrote a paper on this in response to a fairly well-known paper written by Chaim some 20 years ago, Rupture and Reconstruction, that kind of looked at the Enlightenment and Holocaust as the cast that set modern Ashkenazi Judaism, or at least Orthodox Judaism. So we didn't have that response, and therefore the splintering of religiosity in Judaism, right, in the Jewish people, didn't really happen in that way for Sephardic Jews. And I think that one of the reasons for that, and I'm very appreciative that in an hour we are speaking in broad strokes. I just want to put that forth, because we are all, I think, speaking about issues that are so highly nuanced, right, that we're just trying to get some kind of scaffolding for it and kind of orienting towards it. But there is certainly, in Sephardic approach to the Jewish people, the fundamental element is the people. And the philosophy, religiosity, ideology are overlays on that. Interestingly, Michael Wyshegrod wrote an entire book, that kind of really articulates this very well, perhaps not specifically and particularly in the Sephardic mode, but very much that identifies the humanistic, pragmatic, human-centered, national identity as the foundation, right, of the Jewish people, and upon that, the overlay of religion. So for the Sephardic Jews, whether a person was devoutly observant, or a person really was only cursorily connected and maybe came to synagogue on Yom Kippur, everybody was welcome. And in my community, it is precisely the same. Everyone is welcome and recognized. On the back of that, I will acknowledge some of the points that Shuly and Chaim made, that it's a lovely kind of utopian idea, but the reality is that people do need difference in terms of their approach to religious practice and belief and understanding. And it is not enough simply to say that we are welcoming of all people, because the reality is that in my synagogue, my community, and so many other Sephardic communities, around the world, you may not be observant, you'll be completely welcomed and cared for and recognized. But when you get married in an Orthodox ceremony. When you come to synagogue, you are doing an Orthodox liturgy and service. And so that today is something that we have to address. And that is not simply enough to say, well, this is the way that it is, and we love everyone. You know, there is definite nuance and detail that has to be recognized, and that requires response. So I do think that we're post-denomination, but that doesn't mean that we are post-diversity, and we have to rethink how it is that we engage with that diversity.
Thank you. I think that's a great framing for continuing our conversation. One of the things that's occurred to me is that in the current era that we're in, people like to do DIY stuff, right? Do it yourself. And that applies also to religion, in that people are picking and choosing. You know, sometimes they do want, say, an Orthodox service or something from the more traditional end of the spectrum, and other times they want something from the more liberal end of the spectrum. And they're mixing and matching different parts of, I guess, our Jewish denominational history, as well as other spiritual traditions, and really creating their own, whether it's a Judaism of one, right, a me Judaism, or their own new denomination. How is it that you're responding, you know, as denominational leaders to being in this kind of setting? And Rick, why don't you go first on this one, since you didn't have a chance to weigh in?
First of all, great to be in this conversation. I loved what my colleagues said. I would just add, leading into your question, Rebecca, I think we are in a moment where the Jewish community is in maybe the whole religious world is in a really kind of exciting, maybe for some people, concerning moment of dramatic change. And I think denominations suggest that there's a kind of rigidity in terms of theology and liturgy and practice, and that the goal of some larger entity is to kind of regiment how we do Jewish. I mean, to sort of think of your question, a lot of people are doing it themselves. I actually think that a better word for what we are movements. Movements are not so regimented. For example, the civil rights movement in the United States was a huge, and still is a very large, active and diverse group of people trying to do something in the world that's profound. And I think to the degree to which we're all, I believe, doing a similar project, which is trying to keep Judaism vibrant and alive, keep more Jews deeply connected to Jewish life, that's a goal. I don't think I have the rigidity ever within the Reform movement in all matters of practice and thought. And I think this idea of where we are, whether it's post-denominational or trans-denominational, I think what you described is a positive, that I could, you know, show up in any one of the religious communities my colleagues lead and feel like I have something really important to gain from this experience. It's not that they're alien and we're righteous. I mean, that was for a while the kind of the practice of denominationalism. Who are we? We're not them. What do we do? Not what they do. That's not healthy. That's not affirming of the larger project of the Jewish people. So I think in this moment, what matters is what's relevant, what's nourishing, what's important. And I think that's what people are gravitating towards. The do-it-yourself movement is a phenomenon, but I think we need movements. I'm gonna say it in a full-throated way. I was trying to get across town. I live in New York City, and the traffic was unbearable. Nothing was moving. The subways, the buses, the cars, the sidewalk wasn't even moving. This guy pulls over to me in a pedicab. You know, it's like a bicycle with a little place to sit. He goes, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going all the way across town." He goes, "I'll take you." And I thought to myself, no, you're not. And so I thought to myself, in this moment of Jewish life, we think maybe we need lots of different pedicabs, you know, the symbolic comparison. We actually need to get more Jews to the Jewish future. And we can't just be idiosyncratic in the, you know, I love startups. I love creativity. That's kind of like that's the backbone of the Reform movement. But we also have to think in a larger scale. How do we be a Jewish people? How do we collectively stand for something, not in a unanimous way, but in a way that we share some real common important aspirations? And I think if people want to do it themselves, they want to come to the local conservative, Orthodox, Sephardic, Ashkenazi, unaffiliated congregation. I want more people to dig into this thing that we love and to find their inheritance. And I'll just conclude with this idea about diversity. We got more Jews outside of all of our walls. Let's just say it. Every Pew study tells us We can debate all we want. There are more Jews not connected than are connected. That's an urgent question for all of us. And we need to do whatever is best within our kind of worldview to change that, to bring more people into that. And I think that diversity is a source of our strength. It's a source of our creativity. And at times it's really challenging to keep some glue to hold us together. But I think that this moment we're in, I find it exhilarating. And I think if we can be the imagination of a kind of an evolving, changing Jewish community, then this isn't a moment to bite our nails. It's a moment to lean in. And I look forward to the further conversation about all those dimensions.
Rick, I'm coining that phrase. We have to get more Jews to the Jewish future. Love that. We got to put that on a t-shirt. Amazing.
So how? I'm sure our listeners are wondering, great, we all agree, right? We're all here because we care about the Jewish future. And you guys are some of the leaders that we are looking towards, to help lead us there. So how? How do we get to that Jewish future? How do we inspire people even to pick and choose amongst our different movements and denominations and actually try this practice called Judaism? How do we do this?
Look, I think I just want to put a pin on something that Rick said and emphasize it, because I think one of the ways that we begin to do that is, to really, whether it's post or trans or whatever denominationalism, what we're really after is a genuine religious pluralism. And that is not a homogenization, but that is really the respect that we have for others whose commitments to the Jewish future are as deep as our own, but come from a different place or have a different emphasis. And that what we want to do is not be triumphalist about our path, but rather see the value in each stream that is represented in leading lots of Jews, hopefully, to the Jewish future. I have to say, one of my closest friends is a Catholic nun, and we've co-taught together. She has what she calls Shabbos envy, and I envy, she is really, what we would say in our parlance, a gadol hador in Catholic Jewish relations, a real giant. It's painful to me that sometimes the level of mutual respect and admiration is easier to find in an interdenominational setting than in an intra-denominational setting.
And how are we inspiring people to be involved? And
one way is to stop being so bureaucratic. I mean, we're so invested in our structures. It used to be someone would show up in your community and, before you even found out their name, you're handing them some membership form, asking them to write a check. Like and again, that's not to say that we just make everything free. We have institutions. We have people who devote their lives to this. There is a financial dimension, but it's got to be about, people feeling that they're part of this thing we call our Jewish community. And I think and not to speak for or to my colleagues, but we get very invested in the way things are. This is what membership looks like. Synagogues, 150 years ago didn't have, membership dues. You rented pews, at least in the Reform movement, and that was covering all of the financial needs. We didn't have, the structures of Talmud Torah and the synagogue schools as the dominant thing. So we've changed and adapted over the centuries. Sephardic or Ashkenazi, Rabbi Dweck will be certainly better at describing the Sephardic journey. But I think we sometimes feel like, if we change a couple of key things about how we organize, the thing will collapse. I think we just discovered in the pandemic, people are hungry and they want to be nourished. They just aren't, and particularly younger Jews, they're not like getting the whole, apparatus, the scaffolding of Jewish life. Like, how do you negotiate? Which one is that? And why you do this? They want to know what's relevant, what's meaningful. And I do think they're not adverse to digging in deeply. So we can't just have, endless introductions. So I think that we've got to, I'm not suggesting we tear down our buildings or destroy our institutions, But let's remember what's the ikar, what's the essence of it? What is it that we're really about? And if there's another way to organize that's much more conducive to the way younger people or the less connected feel, that should not be threatening. That should be an opportunity. And I think, first among us, I have lots of beloved colleagues and lay leaders. We can all hunker down on the status quo. You change the littlest thing, it's gonna lead to mixed dancing, and all of a sudden you don't know what's gonna happen. But the truth is, I think we are known as a Jewish people because we have this adaptive spirit. That's what's kept us where we are. And I think in some ways, in the last decades, we may have lost some of that DNA. It's worth recapturing.
Yeah, Chaim, go ahead.
Is there, so I that resonates tremendously. There is perhaps coming from an Orthodox perspective of it, right? And I could be completely wrong in terms of kind of sensing, right, that there is perhaps a more of an emphasis on a real concern about moving away from traditional or firmly established law. And in addition to that, I mean, my community here in the UK is the oldest Jewish community in the country. It's 320 years old. And that, on top of it being, for lack of a better term, an Orthodox community, is quite resistant to touching anything, like Rick said, of the edifice, right, of what is intact. And that's a huge element of my, that's challenging to the leadership, right? How do we remain loyal, faithful, respectful of the structures, and at the same time carve out space, which is essential, I think, as Rick is pointing out, to respond to the people that are wishing to engage, wanting to engage, but to whom we need to respond in terms of their experience of the world. So it's a difficult. It's a polarity, right? Where we have to move back and forth. It's almost like inhale and exhale, right? We have to move back and forth to tradition, to the new and back. I mean, two things, because you're asking about specific things, I'll share, two specific things. So during COVID, I took advantage of the fact that everybody was online, and I started a learning platform to kind of teach classical Sephardic approach to Torah and to Jewish thought and practice, because I felt that the volume was kind of low on that, and because we were able to kind of defy geographical restrictions, I was able to get teachers from all over the world and students from all over the world to kind of interconnect. And although I wanted to teach a perspective and an approach, what I found ended up happening, because we made it digital and because it was completely on demand, is that it ended up creating a virtual community in 23 different countries. And we just did a survey, and we found that 91% of the members listened to the recorded classes, not the live classes, right? They're used to being able. So that's an adaptation. This Rosh Hashanah, I'm the senior rabbi. I'm going to be in an alternative minyan, an alternative prayer room. We're starting at Sefer Torah. So the whole opening of the traditional prayers, they can either do themselves or not do. We start there. There's going to be a lot of discussion, a lot of openness to discussing the meaning of the day. And that's happening, as a response to where it is that people are and what it is that they need. And those weren't easy to kind of bring through, but it is absolutely essential, in my opinion, to kind of bring that through, while still understanding that indeed the edifice, the tradition, the kind of the scaffolding of our history is still respected and maintained in some capacity.
Are you playing with that same?
I have a different direction. So I'm going to go. I mean, orthodoxy has. We could have a panel on orthodoxy, but it actually goes back to something that Joseph said in the previous answer, and it really has a lot to do with what Rick was already saying. I think we talk a lot about ideologies, but a lot of it has to do with culture, and that's actually why I pulled out my candies that I have in my office all the time, because a lot of it has to do with just being welcoming. And being welcoming is a very large word. I mean, the reason why I pulled out my candies is because Friday night we had a family that had just moved back from California. The father brought his 2-year-old son to shul, and I forgot to have candies in my pocket. I ran back to my office and brought him a candy, and his father and his grandfather said, don't worry. I said, no, I have to bring him a candy because I want him to come to shul next week. And I want him to know that the rabbi gave him a candy. And that's like a metaphor for something that's much larger. And that is that we need to build welcoming Jewish communities and welcoming Jewish institutions. It's an absolute necessity. It's not just about rabbis doing it. It's not just about synagogues doing it. It's about every Jewish institution recognizing that when someone walks in the door, they should feel like they're at home. And if we don't do that, then we're going to fail, no matter how many different ways that we reinvent, so to speak, the Jewish ideology or the Jewish structures. Without being welcoming, it's not going to work. And by the way, Chabad understands this and executes on this brilliantly. And I think that's really also the second part of it is it's about being a welcoming culture and being also a culture that reaches out. I mean, we've trained ourselves to be very shy about our religion. We've trained ourselves to be very shy about reaching out to others. I mean, I say in synagogue, the reason why a person sitting next to another person might not say hello is because you don't say hello in the elevator when you're in New York, when you're in Manhattan. You don't say hello to people in the elevator. That's like really strange. Even in your own building, like you'll nod or you'll make a remark, but you don't say hi, who are you? And you don't really have those conversations. And to be welcoming, to be open, and to teach individuals that they're part of the community and they represent the community and they should reach out. We have a beginner service on Rosh Hashanah, which is going back for 33 years. And we just sent out a letter to our full congregation saying, if you know someone, if you have a coworker and you think they may not have a place for Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, go to them and tell them we've got a service for you. We've got a place for you to be. And that's all part of building a culture that will actually make every Jew feel at home in a Jewish institution. And as much as we can talk about ideologies, ultimately it's the culture, it's little things like candy that will make an enormous difference in the Jewish future.
So, there's a big joke that goes around that every congregation is, quote, warm and welcoming, right? Like if you look at people's websites, that's what you see. And that's what people talk about. We're a warm and welcoming congregation. But I think seeing it in action is really very different. And this is where I want to push all of you, right? So far we've all agreed on everything and we want Jews to come in and we all agree we want to be pluralistic and help support people. But when push comes to shove, people are not coming to synagogue anymore. Right? People are there is a clearly Pew and a lot of statistics show that there's been a downward trend in terms of both attendance at services and joining congregations and memberships. And to be fair, look, this is true across, at least I know the American context. I don't know the context in Europe. In the American context, overall, this is true within Christianity and within the larger religious context. And as we know, the Jewish community is usually a microcosm of what's going on in the larger culture. But given that we are in this age where people aren't joining, but we know they want community, we know they want belonging, because as Joseph pointed out already, once you go online and make it accessible, people come. So I want to push everybody. What's on your to-do list, right? What are you doing that actually shows the actions behind some of these wonderful words that we have heard so far? And are there places where you guys, maybe not doing the same things or not rowing in the same direction? And what does that mean? So Rick, you were nodding. You want to jump in there?
Shuly, you look like you were jumping as well. So I just want to, first of all, I like candy. No, anybody who wants to argue against candy is going to lose, right? Thank you, Chaim. I'll stop by. I'm not that far from you. I just tell you a story about something, Maaseh Shahaya. This actually happened. I went to one of our congregations. I'm not going to say it about someone else's movement. This is our movement. I went with a colleague of mine at the Union of Reform Judaism who is a Black Jew, proud, learned. We went together to a shul, and we walked in, and I was handed a siddur, a prayer book, and she was handed a brochure. We actually have a brochure very often in our congregations to explain to people who are not Jewish what's going on, who are the people, what's the drama unfolding, what are things called, that's the ark, that's the Ner Tamid. And the person who gave her the brochure and gave me the siddur was unbelievably warm and welcoming. But her concept of what her Jewish community was and who it included did not have my colleague in her, Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. So I tell you that story not because she's a bad person, she's a wonderful person. It's not to say that everybody is harboring some kind of racial animus, but the truth is, one of the things we're working on very intensely is redefining who's the we. In the beginning of this week's, the first of the two parshiot, Atem netzavim hayom kulchem. You are standing this day kulchem, not some, which means all of you, not some of you, not the tall people, or not the people who are your friends, or not the people who live in your neighborhood, all of you. And I think we've lost in our Jewish community the all of you. And I'll just speak for my community. Most people coming into our shuls are part of multi-dimensional families, including people who come from backgrounds that would not be halachically Jewish, but they're hungry and want to come in. So we have some definitional things that I think do get in the way. We can be warm and welcoming and still put up a brick wall. And I'm not to say tear down all the things, Joseph, you said, obviously we need a masort, we need a tradition, we need structures. But I think some of the structures we have are broken and do not define who we are in our strength. And I think that some of what we found, you asked specifics, but one of the things we found during COVID is people showed up online, not just because it was easy, not because they could stay in their pajamas. They showed up online a lot of times to test the water because they weren't sure that if they walked in, they would feel included. They may feel warmly welcome, but would they feel like they belong? So how do we create real communities of belonging, whether it be an overnight summer camp, whether it be a youth group, whether it be part of a shul, whether it's an online group that gathers for learning and some sense of community. The international Sephardic learning, Joseph, that your platform offered, beautiful. That's part of what our ancestors could not have imagined that world. And maybe even our parents could not have imagined that world. That's part of where we are. So let's not throw everything out. But I think things have to get changed. That's some of the Reform DNA. When my predecessor, Alexander Schindler, said, stop pushing interfaith families out the door. Stop telling them they're doing something that's finishing Hitler's work. Bring them in with love and make sure that they know that they're part of the we. Atem nitzavim hayom kulchem. So I think that's broken. We're working not just to make more people feel included, but get them into the real stuff of Jewish life, whether it's practicing, making holidays, learning, opening up books, and seeing what a religious community can do that frankly is profoundly needed in this world. But again, it's not the way that we've organized it. It's the stuff itself that's compelling. But there are places where for us, just think of all the weddings. Pew tells us who's getting married, who we're marrying. Again, if we are able to do that in a more inclusive way, this could be a moment of huge opportunity. But I think the fear that operates throughout our movements, throughout our Jewish world, prevents us from doing some of that. And I believe me, I get that we have different ways to come at that. I'm not meaning to criticize my colleagues. But you asked what we're doing. We're trying to redefine who we are.
Shuly, did you have a response to that as well?
I think that's wonderful. And certainly the concept of inclusivity, that's our starting point. If we don't get them in the door, we can't, we're nowhere. I want to think about it from a little different perspective. Unlike my colleagues, I'm not a rabbi, I'm not a synagogue rabbi, and I'm not the head of the conservative movement. My institution is an educational institution. And, when you talked, Chaim, before about the importance of culture, I think I want to broaden that concept, because Jewish culture is enormous with many, many components. Not everyone who is open to that spark of engagement with Jewish life is interested or ready for a religious engagement with Jewish life. And so I would argue for which is certainly what we do at the Jewish Theological Seminary. I mean, our education is broad and deep. We're having a packed concert tonight of Yiddish nigunim that grew out of material in our rare collection of materials in our library. There's so many elements to Jewish culture, in addition to the more, sacred text study, Talmud Torah, which of course is something that we're doing, and the individuals that we are training for Jewish leadership roles. They are out there in all sorts of different venues. We are not training them only to go into congregational life and work, within the established frameworks, but to go where Jews are and to find them there and to begin to bring them in whatever manner will compel them. And then we can begin to think about their Jewish future. But we need to first engage them. And I want to argue for the broadest possible canvas on which to do that. And, along with the recognizing the diversity of what the Jewish people looks like, there's also the diversity of views among Jews. And as a centrist institution, when you ask what's on my to-do list, it is to bring people from across the Jewish spectrum to think about some of the biggest issues that we face as a people, as Americans, as inhabitants of this planet, and think through together in a deep way of what does Judaism obligate us to do as we think about these issues? And to do that, as I would say, l'shem shamayim va'aretz, for the sake of heaven and earth.
So given that we're living obviously in such a politically divisive time, and I'm glad you touched on that, Shuly, particularly those of you who are pulpit rabbis, how are you dealing with the political divisiveness in your congregations? I am sure that there are people on all sides of the political spectrum, both when it comes to domestic policies, whether you're in the US or Britain, and when it comes to Israel. And how, as kind of establishment Jewish organizations, are you responding to this? And how also in the pulpit, how are you working with this? Because I think this is also something people are concerned about in terms of our leadership. How are we working with people who are on so many different sides of the spectrum? So Chaim or Joseph, if you want to jump in with that, and then we can broaden it.
Yes. That's probably been, I would say that if there was a number one generalized cause of misery for me, in about the last, it's really about 10 years. I mean, I was in Montreal before I came here to New York. And even in Montreal, sometimes politics became very hot. I mean, I happen to have had, one of my members was the previous Minister of Justice in Canada, and there comes up a lot of different things that are ideological. My feeling of it is that it's a tragedy. It's an enormous tragedy. I mean, we were talking about denominations, and my line is that it's bad enough that we've divided into Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. Now we're dividing into Democratic and Republican. That's a tragedy. And if I have to be very honest, I think that in some ways politics, to use a heavy word, is avodah zarah. It's idolatry. It's a substitute method of finding meaning, transcendent meaning, where politics probably is incapable of it, because politics is in many ways very mundane. I mean, I don't want to get into Don Isaac Abravanel's bitter look at politics after he was nearly murdered because of his political career and then expelled. But he looks back at it and he sees politics is, so to speak, one of those necessary items in life, but it's not something that should be idealized. And what we've done is that we've turned politics into an alternate method of meaning. And we've turned our political views into the true ones and the other political views into heresies. And it's very, very deeply troubling to me. And I have to tell you, I have conversations, and I would hope none of them are online now, but I've had conversations with people who are absolutely brilliant, who have PhDs, and I try to reason with them, and I try to say, look, you're talking about politics. Let's look at a bigger picture. Let's look at what items in life are meaningful. And almost everything that you would consider to be meaningful immediately has to be imbued with a fully political identity. I mean, I understand you can't divorce politics from meaning completely, but you don't also need to identify them fully. And I think that is, so to speak, the idolatry of our time, in which we've created an alternate mode of meaning. Now, how do I navigate it? With like I said, with great difficulty and very often with great distress. And you end up being pulled in multiple directions. And I wish this went away. That's the honest truth. I wish this all went away.
So that resonates, and as much as I concur with the wish that it should all go away, I don't think it is anytime soon. And I love that point about a substitute for meaning, because I do see, Jewish thought as a framework for meaning, right? It's a very rich and deep treasury, right, of meaning, and it does aim to be able to provide us a lens with which to be able to see our world. So for me, especially, it's interesting, I'm an American, but I'm living in the UK, and there's no separation from church and state in the United Kingdom. The king is the head of the Church of England, and it's just the way that things run, and you've got bishops sitting in the House of Lords and so on. So it's a little bit different, but I think overall, and I think, the former chief rabbi, Rabbi Sachs, Zatzal, he very much believed that although he was not a politician, and although did not believe that rabbis necessarily should speak in political terms, did very much believe in the advising and the offering of meaning even in the political arena. And I think that that's an important frame. It may be a difficult line to cross, or to kind of get through, because every now and then one finds oneself in the political muck. But I do think that there is a responsibility from thought leadership to offer the meaning frame that Torah might offer, that Jewish thought and wisdom as a tradition might offer. And there are ways, I think, to do that. I don't think that we have to get up onto our pulpits or our classrooms and say, this is my view on this political issue, but I do think that it is worthwhile to teach meaning and to speak to the matters of the day in that way. So I say that recognizing that it is in no way an easy thing, but I don't think it's going away. We are immersed in a political reality that is within a world that is developing in massive complexity and tremendous rapidity, and everybody is just trying to find their bearing. And so it's important, to the degree that we can, to really understand that as best we can and to speak to it. And I do think that is a responsibility, and it is, and it requires the kind of rolling up our sleeves to get into it and get it, and to work in that space as best we can.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in. I think this is urgent for us, because I think sometimes the pathetic strategy is just to avoid anything that's too controversial. So you basically can't talk. We'll just sit in silence. And as Jews, we don't do silence so well anyway. But I do think this notion that politics is somehow a thing off by itself. I mean, I think rabbis, religious communities have talked about public morality. What are the policies that guide our community? What are the values upon which we build it? And I remember I tried an experiment. I was teaching a class and I basically took a passage out of Isaiah and I read it with a very contemporary translation. And somebody put their hand up and said, "There you go. You know, who was that? Was that Barack Obama or was that, Bill Clinton? Come on, I know. Who was that?" I said, "Well, it was a guy named Isaiah." And the truth is, we have a tradition that it refuses to let us, just kind of duck down and stay away. But how do we do it? I think we have communities that don't know how do you live with people with fundamentally different ways of acting on how do we alleviate poverty. We can't ask, is poverty a Jewish issue? Like that's unacceptable. Of course it is. What we do about it, what a political party suggests we do about it, that's open to debate. And I think if we can model in our communities that there are divrei acher, there are different ways of coming to respond. But I think one of the things that young people in particular are urgent about is that the Jewish tradition has a moral voice. In Isaiah, in Isaiah 58, that great haftarah for Yom Kippur morning, raise your voice like a shofar, call out injustice. And I think in many parts of our Jewish community, we get very insular or inside baseball, and the world around us is profoundly at odds with the things that are most prominent in our tradition. So I think we have a moral obligation, but to do it with some humility. I mean, I was a real rabbi for 28 years in community, and a guy pulls me aside before Rosh Hashanah and says, "What's it going to be this year, Rabbi? Politics or religion?" I say, I don't accept the question. I don't accept the question. How do we talk to the issues of the day, but from a Torah perspective, from the core of our tradition, which didn't have one voice? Our tradition is open the Talmud, take any book off of Joseph's shelves or my shelf, or Shuly's got more shelves there in the I'm sure, Chaim, you've got a lot of shelves, we're just not seeing them. You've got a wall there. I'm positive that. And just see the beauty of a complex argument being argued by people who understood that differing, profound differences do not have to lead to demonization. We've lost that. Our communities are just riven with the culture's ugliness. So again, how do we model really thoughtful disagreement, principled disagreement, issues, real substance? And let's not walk away. If we walk away from the world that we're living in and our members are living in, we've actually just abdicated our role as religious leaders.
So given that we've touched on, these political divisions, I think it would be amiss not to mention, obviously, the crisis, I would call it, of the political situation in Israel right now. And do all these nice things that you've been saying about talking across difference also apply to what's going on in Israel? And what about the relationship that has existed, obviously, for decades between particularly the U.S. Jewish community in Israel, and right now the difficulties, that are really being thrown into there? How has that impacted you as denominational leaders, as Jewish thought leaders, and where do you think we're going, and what can be helpful in this moment?
I do want the right to respond to my colleagues. I mean, this is that's also an incredibly critical question, which is even larger than just the divisions. Frankly, it's about an alienation with Israel, which I think needs to be discussed. But I want to just push back for a moment. I mean, I understand why it should be relevant, and one certainly shouldn't hold themselves back from talking about the issues of the day. And there are times where the issues of the day are so large that it doesn't really matter what guardrails you're putting up in terms of not talking about politics, not discussing politics, but where the moral issues are so grand that it would be wrong to withhold your voice. But I want to just make 2 points. First of all, it doesn't matter how subtle, how nuanced, how careful your sermon is, it will always be perceived by those in the congregation who are partisan as speaking in one direction or another. And I'm saying this from years of experience, where I've tried with great care to speak in a very nuanced manner, and yet even so it will be misunderstood. So I think that very often they generate more heat than light. when you do touch certain topics. And the second that I think rabbis need to consider, because we're sort of imagining that we're speaking with the Jewish voice, or a distillation of the Jewish voice, is that we do need to be self-aware of our own political biases. We all have our own political biases, and very often we'll approach a subject even in a certain manner because it is what the political party that I like most would see it as. And we're not, I think we need to be very self-aware as well. So I agree fundamentally with Rick. I would love to talk about a lot of these topics when they're not hot topics, but I think that it has to be done incredibly judiciously. It has to be done very carefully, because I think most of the time it backfires. I mean, in a monolithic congregation, you could speak politics every week because they'll all love it. And there are rabbis that do that. I don't understand how it benefits the congregation, but that's a separate question. But I think in a diverse congregation, if you want to hold the congregation together, I think you have to be really, really wise. If you're going to touch politics, it has to be an exceptional situation, and it has to be done with exceptional wisdom. And even so, you will still be misinterpreted.
Yes, I've certainly seen that to be the case. Any wise words to share in terms of the situation and how you as a thought leader are bringing it either to your congregation or to the other rabbis and lay leaders you're working with in terms of how to approach this moment? And are there denominational differences in how to approach this moment? I would be very curious to hear that. I know I myself live in Teaneck, New Jersey, which is a heavily modern Orthodox community. And in the past, I've had very different conversations with my modern Orthodox neighbors than with, say, my husband's Reform congregants and their views on Israel. So I'm curious to see if there are some real differences between how we're looking at this moment between us.
Well, I think that's where, I think the urgency of this particular high holidays, I would find it unimaginable at some point during the high holidays from every pulpit in every religious Jewish gathering, there's not some reflection about what's happening in Israel. That feels just different. And it feels like you can feel the fabric of our collective being ripped. And I think, this idea, can't we all just get along? Can we just, just be nice and everything will go into its, proper category? I actually think that what's happening with the protest movement is incredibly positive. I think the fact that the flag of Israel, probably on all of our bimas, I'm sure, Joseph, you don't have an American flag, but or maybe you have a flag of Britain, but have an Israeli flag and have that be a symbol of democracy, of the Jewish democratic state. And have people who the deepest love that they have is to be thoughtfully critical, not the harsh critical of tearing down, of demonizing. I think this is a moment to reimagine what being a Zionist looks like. And it doesn't look like one political party, Gewalt, it does not. And I think helping our people feel like Israel is an urgent reality for all of us, whether I'm Ashkenazi or Sephardi, whether I'm Reform and I don't have the ability to perform a wedding and have to even fight my way into a funeral with the Chevra Kadisha in Israel, but somehow it's the project of the Jewish people. How do I, in the midst of that, how does my community in the midst of that still say on some fundamental level, we are in a shared universe of meaning? And I think the state of Israel, honestly, is modeling some of the most problematic parts of the divisiveness that we just mentioned. But if we can't talk about Israel, and there will be people, Chaim, I am sure, that will disagree. But again, I'm not going to give the same speech or same talking points that any politician is going to give. What's at stake for us? And kind of why Jewish and democratic? Why do those things matter? And I think that Israel's the greatest project of the Jewish people. I'm a proud Zionist. I use the Z word. And right away that, creates all kinds of, kind of polarities within our own communities and within the wider community. This is a critical moment for us to have a voice of love and critique. And I think those go together. When those go together, critique without the love is usually, you bleed. The love without the critique is just kind of empty, feels a little bit, naive. So I think this is a moment for us to have a really serious and a very honest conversation about Israel. And I think there are many ways to love Israel. We've been told for the last decades, if you don't love Israel in a particular way, you don't love Israel. I find that offensive. I've been the recipient of that critique. And I think that a lot of people in the Jewish community don't relate to that and want to be able to find, honestly, a place for themselves in the debate about all these issues. And to say that if you criticize, those who, want to do this to the Supreme Court or want to do that to, the whole notion of shared burden, I just think this is so fundamental to what it means to be Jewish in the modern world. We ignore it at our peril. We enter it with our peril as well. But can we raise a religious voice, spiritual voice, an Am Yisrael, a people's voice of questioning? And I think the last thing I would just say, Chaim, the difference to me, if I raise a voice in a self-righteous, arrogant way, whatever I'm going to get, I probably deserve. But I can also raise things with, some openness to the art divrei acher. The great poem by Yehuda Amichai, Hamakom shebo anu tzodkim, the place where we are righteously right is a very harsh place. A place where we have questions, we wonder, we're curious. That opens conversation, that opens dialogue. I think we need many more of those kinds of conversations.
Here. And certainly, as an educational institution, that's what we thrive on. And that is something we're modeling for our students. Certainly in our undergraduate program, we have Jews across the spectrum of Jewish life with views that span that spectrum. And part of what we are preparing them for in using their voices out there in the world is also, as students, learning to listen, to truly listen, to listen to other voices, to be able to have those difficult conversations. It breaks my heart that we don't talk about Israel because it's so painful. And, as what you were describing, Chaim, it's so divisive that we consciously or unconsciously, we steer clear of those conversations, but we can't. We must. And so what
you can't have a Pesach Seder if you talk politics, Shuly. You just can't. Imagine having a Pesach Seder talking politics. No, it ends the Seder. You can cut it off right there.
Yes. So look, what we're trying to do is model a different way of doing that in the classroom in the hopes that this will fortify our students, not only with knowledge, but with experience to do that. And,
so
part of what religious leadership involves is being able to do things in a way that it can be heard. And part of what we're saying is if it can't be heard in a way that is effective, then it becomes a tool of further alienation.
So we have 5 minutes left in our time together. And in that last 5 minutes, I'm wondering if each of you could give your aspirations for the year to come as we are looking at a new year and we're looking forward dealing with a very challenging political environment, both domestically and abroad and in Israel. Given the challenge of our denominations even relevant today, I'm not sure we came to, a clear answer on that. We talked a lot about coming together and welcoming people, but what are the relevances and what are you aspiring to do in the next year? So first up, Joseph, why don't you go first?
Yeah, it's hard to put it into 5 minutes, but I'll just say this. For me, it's education and love. And I you know, I don't want to sound too flowery about it, but what I mean by the love bit, I'll start with that, is that what we've been speaking about. It's about welcoming. It's about opening portals for people to connect as a community and as proud Jews. So, you know, that's a major guide for so much of the, you know, the things that we do as a community, and you know, the projects that I really aim to kind of work on and support. So that's a major part of it. And the second is education. It's, you know, at my heart, I'm an educator and a student. And the educational dialogue, I mean, it is the great tradition of our people. And that is something that I think is the birthright of every Jew, that there's dialogue, there's question, there's understanding, there's exploration. And to whatever degree, you know, in my little corner that I can help facilitate that in its myriad ways, it is what I know that I can try to do. You know, it's the things that I can try and contribute. And so, you know, I'm not thinking globally. If that happens, great. But I'm thinking about my people, my community, my organizations that I can, you know. And so those are the guiding aspects for me. It's education and it's love. And yeah, it's what we're aiming for.
Great, Shuly.
I will build on that. I certainly agree with both of those aspirations and aspire to the same. I would add to that one of the things that we have not mentioned that is a challenge that the Jewish world faces, and that some of the pain that I'm hearing from my rabbinic colleagues lifted up here is the challenge of finding the next generation of individuals who will follow in our footsteps as Jewish leaders. And some of the challenges that you've mentioned are things that give young people pause about considering careers in the rabbinate and in other Jewish educational roles. So my hope for the year is that we will find ways to draw more people into careers of service for the Jewish people, and that I know you all love what you do, in addition to feeling these frustrations, and that we will be able to all communicate that love and the amazing rewards that come from the work that we all do, and that we will be able to find support for them in all the ways that they will need it, you know, spiritually, intellectually, financially, to take their place.
Great, Chaim. And you're on mute. We couldn't get through a whole webinar without somebody being on mute.
So I wasn't sure if you were talking personally or communally. I mean, I think the thing that I would hope for, which is a large hope, but once you're hoping, it might as well be something large, is I mean, I think the issue is that we all have what one philosopher called the buffered lives. And when you have this sort of buffering where you sort of are cocooned and firmly ensconced in a life that you could be completely protected from everything else, even other human beings, it's very difficult to have faith. It's very difficult to have community. It's very difficult to accept people who disagree with you. So I think if we can somehow get out of those cocoons, break through that buffer, I think our community would just be a lot stronger.
Thank you. And last but not least, Rick.
Amen to my colleagues. It feels to me like, you know, in the coming year, 5784, if we can collectively get more of us to touch the live embers of the Jewish tradition, to get less caught up in how it's structured or how it's delivered, and just, you know, when you experience the thing in its beauty, you know, whether it's at summer camp or in a shul or, you know, in some alternative group that comes together, the things that we've been doing as a people for 3,000 years are just incredibly powerful, meaningful, and needed. So I also think that, you know, a lot of times our Jewish world looks like a club, and we're just trying to keep everybody in the club. I think there's something profound each of us has been put on the world to do, which is to shape a more just, a more compassionate, a more whole world. That's what, Jewish life is. We're partners with the Holy One. And to the degree to which we can see the bigger picture and each of us do our part and help more people do their part, and together see that diversity, that mosaic of Jewish life is something rich and powerful, sometimes maddening, but ultimately redemptive. I think that takes us, just the last phrase comes from another Amichai poem, Ba'ir Hatika, in the Old City, where he says, we Jews are niguei tikva. Niguei from infected. We're infected with hope. And I know that to be true. We know that to be true. So in the midst of all that ails us, and there's a lot, and all for the listeners who've been, quietly tapping in thoughts, can we in some way, access that part of us that not only is hopeful, but is ready to roll up our sleeves and open our hearts and move the project of the Jewish people forward?
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much. Thank you to Shuly, Rick, Chaim, and Joseph for taking the time out of your busy schedules to speak with us about the future, not only of denominationalism, but obviously of the Jewish endeavor overall. And I hope that our listeners have been able to take some really important seeds with them that will plant and grow over the next year and the years to come. I wish everybody a Shana Tova U'Mituka, a sweet, happy, healthy, prosperous new year. And we look forward to seeing everybody together with us in Tel Aviv in March for our JFN conference. It'll be March 17th through 20th. And go online to look for more information. And we really are looking forward to seeing all of you there, where we will delve even more into all of these very important issues. So thank you. Shana Tova. Take care.
Shana Tova. Shana Tova.